Hello everybody, and in this video we're going to be looking at a game played in 1921 between Capablanca, who was white, and Lasker, who was black, played in Havana. And this video is going to be about space advantages and how to effectively play when you have a space advantage. So the game started with d4, d5, knight f3, so this avoids a lot of mainline theory, and black plays pawn to e6, so white now transposes into a queen's gambit declined, knight f6, and bishop g5 is now played. Not the most common move, but it certainly has a point to it. It pins black's knight, develops a piece, and it indirectly controls the center by limiting black's piece, which is controlling the center. So after knight bd7, e3 is played. So the bishop is now outside of the pawn chain, and I like this starting setup from white. Black plays bishop e7, which is a perfectly good move. Now knight c3, and black castles. So both sides are following a main the mainline theory of the time, and here it looks roughly even. So when white continued with rook c1, that isn't the most usual plan, but there are ideas of playing bishop to d3 and at some point perhaps retreating it to b1, so it doesn't interfere with the queen or rook's influence of one of the open files. Also, it could have possible threats on h7. Also, the rook usually ends up on c1 anyway, so there's a potential idea of taking on d5 as well at this point, and then trying to target the black's pieces on the c file, namely the pawn on c7, perhaps by playing knight b5 as a later point. So here, a rather unusual move was played, rook to e8, which I'm not really sure I like. I understand the idea that if white takes the pawn on d5, black will recapture with his own pawn, and then the rook on e8 may be doing something useful on the semi-open e file. But if white just doesn't take on d5, that rook looks slightly misplaced at this point. And I originally found this game that I'm showing you in a book by Gombolek on Capablanca. It's called Capablanca's 100 Best Games of Chess. And he remarks in this book that the better move, which I agree with, is c6, which just is fine. This is like a Slav, basically. So one possible line is bishop d3, takes, knight b6, bishop drops back, and then black can do the thematic idea of placing a knight onto d5. And after white trades bishops, then we have a fairly even position here, with white again having a small space advantage, but due to the trades that have occurred, perhaps this isn't so bad for black. I think it's manageable here. So this is a possible line if Lasker had played more accurately. Instead, rook e8, and then queen to c2. So now the queen and rook are definitely lined up on the c file, so there's potentially some pressure being exerted by white, as well as bishop to d3 perhaps being played later, and that way there will be a queen and bishop battery set up against the h7 pawn. So now Lasker plays pawn to c6, and I think this move is strongest. Bishop to d3. Maybe you could delay the move, as Golombek points out, with a move like a3, but I'm not so sure that's such an amazing move. Perhaps just black playing a5 might be okay. Now black does take to provoke the bishop into moving again. And knight to d5 is now played. So I would have played knight b6 first, but small nuance though. It's not a huge deal. Bishop takes bishop, and now this move I do not understand. The move I would play in this line would be queen takes. After white castles, I may well trade on c3. And after b takes, then black could engineer a pawn break with e5. So after, say, e4, and I would capture, white does have 2 pawns in the centre, but black is going to be able to release the bishop on c8 fairly quickly with a move like knight b6, and then bishop g4 perhaps. So although white may have a very small advantage, black also has trump cards here. Most importantly is the queenside majority, which could be very useful in the endgame. The 2 central pawns do gradually become weaker as more pieces are exchanged. So in the long term it favours black, but in the short term white is the favourite in this position. Note though that queen takes e4 would be met decisively with rook f to e1, and black may as well resign. After queen takes queen, white has the Zwischenzug rook takes e8 check, and will be a rook up. So apart from a few little cheap tactics, black is doing fine here. So in the game, after the trade, black retook with the rook. And I think the idea is to later on easily be able to double rooks. But the flaw in this idea is that it's hard to get the bishop and knight out of the way, for one. And also, the rooks being disconnected can often lead to favourable tactics for the other side. It doesn't feel right. It seems to displace and you're not really coordinating your pieces very well. So I would say rook takes e7 is a big question mark. White castles, and now knight to f8. So the rerouting of black's pieces has begun. And white now puts the rook onto d1, so that's a very good idea. As I said before, putting your rook on the same line as the enemy queen can often favour you. What it does prevent, though, is black wants to break with c5 or e5 later on in order to let the bishop on c8 breathe a little, and to prevent white gaining a huge space advantage. But what white is doing with rook fd1 is discouraging either of those 2 moves, because if black now plays a move like c5, white would then take, and the queen could be very exposed to white's rook. So bishop to d7 was first played, and this isn't such a bad move. Perhaps bishop e8 followed by placing both rooks on the c-file might be an idea for black. I might actually here have played the move b5, trying to gain some space on the queen side. This may not be the best move, but it does feel somewhat necessary. Maybe I could play bishop d7 then b5, but I feel I need to get in a pawn break quickly. e4, and I don't really like the move knight takes c3. This wasn't played in the game, but if knight takes c3, I think that white can actually play queen takes c3. So the queen and rook are still on the semi-open c-file, and white could then restrict any c5s from black by playing a3 and b4, and then black is really struggling to nullify white's space advantage and find good squares for the pieces. So instead, knight to b6 was played, and the bishop drops back. It's rather surprised me, this move, but I actually really like it the longer I look at it. Bishop to f1. Now this is actually a rather good move. What it does is it keeps the option open of being able to play. It keeps the option open of being able to play g3 and bishop g2, perhaps in the future. Queen e2 could be played to put all three heavy pieces onto three different semi-open files in the future. And it avoids a trade of pieces, which again will favour black due to black wanting to have fewer pieces on the board to restrict the cramped conditions that he's in. So rook c8 was now played. Again, c5 is the idea. So how does white prevent that idea from happening? Yeah, white plays b4. So this is keeping a space advantage, it's increasing the space advantage, and it's just restricting black's pawns as well as the pieces. So this is already looking very tricky for black to find a way out of this. So bishop e8, and now the queen just goes to b3. So it's getting out of the same line as the rook. That way the rook won't ever be able to play c8 takes c2. And it also could, in the future, help play d5, which is a thematic space grab, or pawn break, which is played by white in a lot of Queen's Gambit openings. And often it will either create so much space and open up the position that black's lack of coordination will favour white and often create tactical circumstances that lose black material or perhaps even lead to checkmate. And what it can also do is sometimes it can create a passed pawn on d5. So there's that to bear in mind as well. And black now plays rook e to c7. So it prevents d5 and b5 being played, seeing as two double rooks on the open c-file would be good for black. It would give black compensation. So now a4 is played. So the only black piece that's on the third rank or further is the knight on b6. So Capablanca wants to push it back even further so that black's pieces are only on the first and second rank, and white's pieces are still going to be dominating the centre of the board. Knight g6 is played. So that is past the reason that the knight went to f8, was to come to g6. Perhaps it could move to f4, going into white's territory and attacking some of the key light squares. But more often it helps with an e5 break later on, and it can also perhaps better maneuver to the d5 square in the future. So knight on g6 is definitely improving pieces. a5, and now the knight has to drop back to d7. So the move a5 is good because although it does weaken the b5 square, how is black ever going to get a piece onto b5? If black can't exploit the weakness, then I argue it's not really a weakness. And a move like a6 from black, which would take control of b5 completely, would in turn weaken the dark squares, and white's knight could then jump into either b6 or c5. So white's space advantage is allowing him to grab more squares and gives him more license to weaken certain squares left behind by the advance of the pawns. And black is so cramped that he can't organise his pieces to take advantage of these. So the move which I would consider, but perhaps not play, is d5, which is very thematic. But in this position, it doesn't really work out so well. After black takes, white takes, pawn takes, and let's say rook takes, black's doubled rooks on the c-file are going to give him enough compensation to be practically level in this position. Maybe a move like queen e7 would be good for black here. So d5 also is taking away the central control that white has with the pawns. So why would white take away his space advantage, which is the main advantage he has here? Instead, e5 is very strong because it now prevents black playing e5 forever, and b4 and d5 have prevented black breaking with c5 as well. So black now has none of the original pawn breaks that are so thematic and necessary for the success of his opening. The only pawn break left for black is the f6 break, which would try and trade on e5 and allow black to perhaps develop the bishop to g6 or h5. But here, e6 is under threat from white's queen, and even if he could defend it, the e6 pawn would eventually probably fall to white's pieces. So this is an excellent illustrative game by Capablanca, just showing how much he can press black. b6 is played, so black knows that f6 won't work, so he has to try and manufacture something on the queen side. Knight e4, so that d6 square, again it's facilitated by the pawn on e5. d6 looks like a lovely square for the knight. Rook b8 is now played, so there's a small threat of b takes a5. And here Golombek suggests the move queen a3 here, which, after looking at it for a while, I do agree it's a better move than what was played in the game. But I would probably have not played it, if I'm being honest. I would probably have played a move like queen c2. Queen c3 was played, and now knight f4. So the knight is rerouting to d5, where it will hit the queen for a spare tempo. Knight d6 and knight d5. So at this point, the queen does retreat to a3. So Golombek points out that if the queen had gone there originally, in this position it would be white's move, so white would stand better with the extra tempo. But even without it, white's position is looking fantastic. There's a octopus knight, as you may call it, when a knight's on the enemy third rank, just controlling so many squares in black's territory. f6, so black's trying to dislodge the knight from d6. And here, white actually takes. I think the reason is that black's bishop may then start to look good when it goes to h5 or g6. So Capablanca feels that the knight on d6 won't play such a significant role in the future, so it's a favourable trade. Queen takes and e takes. So Capablanca has now switched from trying to shut down all of black's pieces to opening things up, which is actually very favourable here. If either of the knights take the pawn on f6, then the e-pawn is going to be isolated and very weak, as well as the e5 square being very good for white's knight. So g takes f6 is now played. And again, this has opened up the position, and because white's pieces are so well coordinated and black's are not, this should favour white, as well as the black king is slightly exposed on g8. So the game continues with b5, trying to open things up even more. Rook bc8 and takes. So Lasker recaptures and Capablanca trades rooks. So removing black's strong challenge on the c-file. Now black does control the c-file, but only with one rook. So this does reduce black's counterplay in terms of attack. A takes and A takes. So black is now left with a rook on c6, which is controlling the c-file, but does look a little bit misplaced. An isolated pawn on b6, hanging pawns in the centre, and a slightly exposed king. White does have a rook on the d file, which may be better on the b or e files. The pawn on d4 is isolated, but it could be argued it's restricting the movement of the d7 knight. And the bishop could be very useful here. In the game, rook e1 was played, but I prefer bishop b5, pinning black's pieces. So after a move like rook c7, you could either pressurize the d7 knight with a move like queen a4, or you could take advantage of black's limited mobility and just improve your pieces slowly with a move like rook e1, and then perhaps queen d6 next move. So I like this position here. Instead, rook e1 immediately I feel is just a little bit inaccurate. So queen c8 was now played. Again, it's creating counterplay on the c file, so that there's some small amount of pressure being exerted on the position, but a very small amount. And I don't feel that white's king is in any real danger. So Capablanca continues with knight d2, a retreating move that isn't without some venom. It's going for the e4 square, and perhaps even jumping into d6 at a point in the future. So that could be a very strong position for a knight to be, either e4 or d6. It feels like it's threatening a lot more than the knight on d5, and the bishop on f1 seems to have a lot more targets than the knight on d7 as well. So white's pieces just generally seem to be able to attack more than black's pieces. Finally, knight to d2 has freed up the g3 square for white's queen, so there might even be an annoying few checks involved in a few tactical sequences in the future. So knight f8, perhaps rerouting to g6 is a good idea. Knight e4 and queen d8. So it's preventing white's knight from infiltrating onto d6, but I feel that black is just moving to and fro with the queen and rook and knight. It doesn't feel like black is progressing in any measurable way, whereas white is clearly improving the pieces. The last piece to be improved will be the bishop on f1, I think. h4 is played first, though, so part of the reason for that is that if black played f5, the white knight would be forced to retreat some more. But if black played f5, then the white knight could play, after bishop b5 and rook c7, knight g5 is quite strong here. The e6 pawn is now backward, targeted by the knight and rook, and it's quite hard for black to defend this for indefinitely, because the bishop, knight, rook and queen could all target that square. After, say, rook e7, bishop c4 could be very strong here. Rook e8 and maybe queen g3. So here this just looks bad for black, and I think white's winning by quite a margin. So going back, h4 is useful for that reason. f5 is not played. Gombolek actually suggests h6, which is backed up by computer evaluation. The idea is just to be able to play f5 with knight g5 not being possible. To be honest, I'm not sure what I would do in this position. I might just have played knight g6, trying to go for reroute to e7, then to f5. But it is very hard finding a good plan for black due to the bad coordination, very weak pawns as well. So instead, rook c7 was played, so another what I would consider meaningless maneuver with the rook, and white just continues to build up with queen b3, rook g7, and white just prevents disaster with g3. So it's just a useful defensive move, creating a bit of luft for the king, it creates a pawn chain. The one thing I'd have against it is that queen g3 might have been a good move in the future, and that's now prevented. But overall, I don't consider g3 a bad move. Rook a7 has nothing better to do, and white just continues to improve with bishop c4. So now the bishop and queen are lined up against the knight, the pawn, and the king, all on that diagonal. So, just as an example, there is another threat of if black just made another useless rook move, let's say rook a8, white can actually win material here with bishop takes d5, and if pawn takes d5, then queen takes d5 check. So black pretty much has to take it, and then knight takes f6 will win back the queen, and white will be 2 pawns up. So that's also a threat that needs to be seen. So instead, rook a5 was played to defend the d5 knight, and here knight c3. So again, it's just targeting d5, and that knight is pretty much paralyzed. If the black knight moves, then e6 will be under fire. So, unfortunately, it just doesn't feel like black can hold this position. Knight takes was played, so again, black is attempting to trade off to reduce the worry that white's pieces are creating. Queen takes c3, and the king now comes over to do a bit of work and defend the pawns. Queen e3, so again e6 is the target. Queen d6, and now quite a sneaky move, queen to e4. So I like this move. It's a move I would play generally. It does look fairly innocuous at first glance, but what it's threatening is the h7 pawn, which is tying down black's knight. There could be the idea of perhaps playing f4 and then f5 in the future, sort of being able to do a pawn storm against the king and the weak pawn on e6. But the final thing it's threatening, which I don't think Lasker picked up on, or at least underestimated, is queen b7, putting the queen on the 7th rank. And this is why Gombolek, and me too, I also suggest rook a7 instead of the move played, rook a4. Because now, queen at b7, and king to g6, then another check with bishop d3 could be good, but instead Capablanca first plays queen c8. So that's also good, it's stacking the pawn on e6 again. Although the computer gives a lovely line with h5 check, which I don't think I'd have spotted, because after king takes, there's a fantastic move, queen g7. And now it's the king is just so unprotected, and black's pieces just are not. There's no cohesion between any of black's pieces. The king is just a target now. So rook takes bishop, g4 check, king h4, queen takes f6 check, and it's mate in a few moves. After king takes g4, rook e4 check, and then either piece to h4 is mate. So that would be an improvement over the game, h5 check. So queen c8 is not perfect, but it is a very good move that pressurizes black's position. And now queen b4 is played. So it's attacking both the bishop and the rook at the same time. Capablanca parries this threat with rook c1, and the queen then retreats to e7. So here, Capablanca finished off the game with a flourish after bishop d3 check, and the best move is actually f5, but that would not be too good either because of rook c7. Instead, king h6 was played, and rook c7. Now, a spite check is thrown in, and the king retreats. Another useful aspect of g3 is that the king can go to g2, and there are no more sensible checks. After queen d6, can you see the move that Capablanca played to force resignation here? Okay, well, the move played was queen takes f8 check, and here black resigned, because if queen takes queen, then there's a checkmate with rook takes h7, and if for some reason the king moves away, then there's still a bunch of checkmates, namely rook takes h7, and because I like to checkmate with pawns if I can, I would play f3 checkmate. But there's also queen checkmates as well. So basically, what I found really good about this game and very instructive was how from even the earliest point in the game, after say this position that you see here, white just slowly builds up, just keeps the space advantage, doesn't liquidate too much. The only real trade that he makes is the one on e7, which which sort of weakened black's position, because the bishops here are not equal, shall I say. Black's bishop is doing a very good job targeting the dark squares, and when white removes it, black's dark square control is permanently weakened. So if you want to keep a space advantage in your games, you don't want to trade off your pieces, because then it's much harder to limit the scope of the remaining pieces. What you want to do is just cramp your opponent by forcing all their pieces into small little boxes. So after white coordinates and has developed fully, black still hasn't moved 3 of the pieces on the back row, and there are 2 other pieces, the knight and king, that look just completely underdeveloped. The rook on e7 looks a bit ridiculous, and the knight on d5 is the only useful piece black has. So white just forces it back, as you saw, and then just keeps on playing simple chess, not doing anything too complicated, and just gaining space with the pawns and making sure he keeps that space advantage. He doesn't trade off, just keeps reinforcing and doing a little bit of maneuvering. And here, white didn't mind keeping tension on a5 and b6. He knew that if black took, black would have isolated pawns on a7 and c6, so black would have a weakened position. Therefore, why should white trade off then? If black can't trade off, then white should just keep the tension as it is and just carefully maneuver his forces. And then only when the time is right should white open up the position and use black's badly coordinated pieces to gain more advantages. So here it was good because of black's position. The pawns on the 6th rank are all quite hard to defend, and the knights as well. They may look quite pretty, but they aren't actually able to create any threats, and they're just reduced to being very passive defenders, as well as the heavy pieces. And white has all the advantages, all the attack, all the initiative. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.